What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you today with our official early redraft wide receiver rankings. We're going to go through the top 15 wide receivers in depth, top 20, 23 or so wide receivers overall between me and Danny, the way we see it for 2021 fantasy football. If you guys enjoy this video at any point, as always, like the video, comment any of your thoughts down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. We just hit that 3,500 subscriber mark. Thank you guys for helping us get there. That was our goal by the end of May to get there. So we'll keep you updated on what our goal is for June. We're going to have something involved in that. Danny, how are you doing?
Doing well. Again, if you guys are watching this video, you would have supposedly already have seen the quarterback rankings. And this is a whole week thing, baby. We're bringing you the rankings every single day of this week. You guys were clamoring for some redraft. We've been doing dynasty all off season. And yeah, get ready to roll up the sleeves and set the tone on these rankings.
Yep. So we're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get into these wide receiver rankings. On the screen right now, you guys are going to see the top 20 wide receiver rankings that, as we see it, this way too early look. We're going to be updating these, obviously, going through the offseason. We're going to give our final rankings, the last 2 weeks or so of August, and then we'll go through a little bit more in depth at that point. But we're going to start with our wide receiver one, both of our wide receiver ones right now, and that's Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, I mean, let's keep it brief with Tyreek Hill. This speedster from the Kansas City Chiefs is the wide receiver one going into redraft again. With all the uncertainty around Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers, this is the next best guy. And don't look at it as a consolation because this guy's an absolute savage, absolute stud in his own right. Let's keep it brief. He's the best deep threat in the entire league and has been these past 3 years. Wide receiver 3, wide receiver 9 in points per game, and wide receiver 2 in points per game since 2018, respectively. It just goes to show you that even in that wide receiver 9 year, he was dealing with hamstring issues, injuries linger up all that year, and he was still able to finish as a top 10 receiver on a points per game basis. When he is on the field, as we mentioned with Mahomes yesterday, this is as consistent as you can get from a 12-plus touchdown, 1,200-plus receiving yard threat, and can outright just win you games on your own. We could talk about running backs maybe winning your weeks in terms of their potential. Tyreek Hill is that one receiver where you could be down 35 going into Monday Night Football, have Tyreek Hill on your team, and you still have a chance at winning that game. And that week winning type of upside is just really unparalleled aside from maybe Davante Adams in this entire landscape. So Tyreek Hill is one of the true difference makers in football at the wide receiver position. And don't just fade him because people want to put him under this boom bust narrative, because he's shown in recent years he's had the boom weeks, but he hasn't really had the bust recently since Mahomes has took over. So take Tyreek Hill. He's your wide receiver one and definitely worth a top 12 to 14 pick at minimum.
Right. And he's a guy that is going to be, I would say, a guy that gets less volume than some of the other guys that we're going to talk about, but it's okay because a Patrick Mahomes target, we don't have an actual quantifiable amount of how much more valuable a Patrick Mahomes target, especially a deep target, is than a Ryan Tannehill target or whoever else that we're going to talk to, a Kyler Murray target or an Aaron Rodgers target. But Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback in the league. Tyreek Hill, in my opinion, is the most talented receiver in the league. I think he strikes the friggin' fear of God into every defensive coordinator in the NFL. And that entire offense is made possible because of him and because of Travis Kelce. And I think Tyreek Hill is as safe a bet as it comes for a top 5 finish, in my opinion. So we can move on to the next guy, and that is going to be Stefon Diggs. And big rise for Stefon Diggs. We finally have Stefon Diggs in an alpha wide receiver role with a great quarterback. And target volume was always a problem for Stefon Diggs in Minnesota. In 2019, I believe he had less than 100 targets. He had like 94 targets. And last year, he improved upon that by adding about 70 more and leading the NFL with 166 targets after finally being entrusted with a true alpha role in an NFL offense. And when you look at how consistent he was from a target volume standpoint and from an involvement standpoint, he had 9 games last year with double-digit targets and not a single game with lower than 6 targets. Diggs was the complete model of consistency and should be one of the more consistent options going forward with John Brown now gone as well. With his release, there's no significant target competition for Stefon Diggs that was brought in. They still have, Gabe Davis and Cole Beasley, but none of those guys really are going to threaten Stefon Diggs for even a 1B type of role. They're all going to fit in as tertiary options behind Stefon Diggs. And I mentioned this as a potential concern for Josh Allen because it is only Stefon Diggs that he has as a true consistent weapon, but it's a positive for Diggs, obviously, because that locks him in to 150 to 175 plus target potential. And that kind of projection remains reasonable, which is very, very rare at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, for sure. When you're looking at Stefon Diggs and you combine the factors of his route running, his separation, he is as smooth as butter. There may not be a single person in the NFL who has that combination of route running and separation like Stefon Diggs. And although, again, he doesn't really have that competition around him, so people may argue, well, what if he sees a little bit more bracket coverage? Well, what if defenses pay more attention to him? He is a type of receiver that can get away from that. If we're talking about a primary X deep threat, maybe they're not able to get away from the bracket coverage, but because Stefon Diggs is so smooth, because Stefon Diggs is so versatile, he can be used across the formation. They're going to get him his looks. They're going to get him his targets. As you mentioned, only one game where he had less than 6 targets. That is the absolute model of consistency. So he is my 3, and he's well worth that second round pick. But we can move on and we can actually talk about
quick on Diggs.
That
would have happened last year too. If he was receiving bracket coverage and number 1 cornerbacks and all that stuff, that would have happened last year. So if that's anybody's concern with him, don't be, because he saw this last year. Teams knew he was the best receiver on the team last year too. And like you said, he's moved in the slot, he's moved across the formation, and he's a 3-level threat. He can affect the deep game, the intermediate game, and the short game. He's not just, as much as I love Mike Evans, Mike Evans doesn't really affect the short game of the field, so you can bracket him easier than a guy like Stefon Diggs. So like you said, we're going to move on to the next guy, and that's going to be Sir Arthur James Brown of the Tennessee Titans, and I'll let you get into him as our wide receiver 3.
Yeah, so I mentioned, again, this is actually currently my 2, as you guys would have seen on the graphic, and I love Stefon Diggs. He's well worth that middle second round pick in your redraft leagues, but I personally would take A.J. Brown over him. When you're looking at A.J. Brown as a whole, he averaged 17.7 PPR points per game last year, which was a wide receiver 6 pace. And in those 14 games he played with Ryan Tannehill, had a 80 reception, 1,230 yard, and 12.5 touchdown pace across 16. That's on 7.6 targets per game. Now, the team vacates nearly 192 targets. And people are going to say right off the bat, well, A.J. Brown's going to have a Stefon Diggs, Davante Adams. No, he's not going to get that target share. I understand that. But if we're projecting this guy from that 80 reception, 120 target type pace last year, even if we bump him up to, let's say, 135, maybe at best 140 targets, we're talking about a guy that if he received that near 9 target per game threshold that we've seen some of the elite receivers do, he produced wide receiver 6 point per game numbers on the low volume he got last year. He is always going to be one of the most efficient wide receivers in the entire NFL and is always going to consistently flirt with that 12, 13 type touchdown ceiling because that's the type of player he is. He can score on any point, any time on the field. He could take a slant to the house. He could take a fade to the house. He can really use any route to his any route that he has and really be able to score, really be able to capitalize off of it. So talk about home run ability of Tyreek Hill. I think A.J. Brown may be that number 2 wide receiver in terms of week winning potential, given the fact that this guy on any given play can win you a week.
Right. And I actually have him at wide receiver 4. As you said, you have him at wide receiver 2. The 2 guys I have ahead of him, we'll get into the next guy right now, in DeAndre Hopkins. The reason I have DeAndre Hopkins and Stefon Diggs ahead of A.J. Brown is because while A.J. Brown is an efficiency projection, because I agree with you, I don't think we're going to be expecting 170 target season from A.J. Brown. If we get that, he can absolutely finish as the wide receiver 1. But I think more realistically, we're looking at 140 to 150 targets ceiling. And because of that offense, because of the way that they run the ball. And DeAndre Hopkins will exceed those numbers. He absolutely will. And he also has the ability to be efficient in his own right, as does Stefon Diggs. So the reason I have Diggs ahead of Hopkins, though, is due to the quarterback play of the Buffalo Bills with Josh Allen versus the Cardinals with Kyler Murray. Hopkins accomplished basically the same feat of an elite wide receiver switching teams that Stefon Diggs accomplished last year by finishing second in total targets, only behind Diggs on route to his own top 5 finish in fantasy. And Hopkins dealt with a target quality rating ranked 63rd in the NFL, whereas Diggs ranked number 20. And that's exactly the difference I talked about with Josh Allen versus Kyler Murray. I trust Josh Allen to get Diggs the ball a lot more than I do with Kyler Murray, especially given the fact that in the important areas of the field, both guys run the ball, but Kyler Murray, it seems like, runs it a little bit more in terms of the red zone usage. And we saw that when Kyler Murray was healthy, that was basically what they did in the red zone. And that might explain the reason that DeAndre Hopkins only had 6 touchdowns last year and Diggs only had 8. But I think there's a very real possibility that both of these guys could get the double-digit touchdowns, but I would bet on Diggs getting it over DeAndre Hopkins. Either way, these guys both still have room to grow. Hopkins especially has room to grow in the touchdown department. Overall, though, I expect him to be a top 5 lock, to be honest. With the target volume that he's going to be seeing, those touchdowns need to improve a bit for him to achieve that wide receiver 1 overall ceiling. But I'd be hard-pressed to rank this guy outside of my top 5 with the 170 type target pace that he's going to have.
Yep, I absolutely agree. Again, this 2 to 5 range, I actually have Hopkins at 5. We'll get into who I have at 4 in a second, is so tough. These are all guys well worth that late second round type draft capital. And quite frankly, I always preach, you want to hit that honey spot of receivers between the 3rd and the 6th round. These are the guys that I would take an exception for. If the running backs I like dry up by the point where an AJ Brown, Stefon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins are on the board, I'd be fine with taking these guys in the 2nd round because I know they are as locked in as top 5, top 6 options at this position as really any of the other running backs would be from a projection standpoint. So I fully agree. DeAndre Hopkins is a beast. You know what you're going to get. He's going to be a top 5, 6 lock. And let's get into the next guy now because he's kind of similar to Hopkins in terms of what you can expect. Only he's shown that touchdown ceiling. The problem with him is he going to have that touchdown ceiling? Is he going to have that target output with the possible change at quarterback? And yes, we're talking about Davante Adams. Let's keep it brief with him. We all know the issues around Davante Adams right now. If Aaron Rodgers is gone, is Jordan Love ready to take that step? Is any replacement quarterback they can get ready to take that step? This has nothing to do with his on-field ability because we saw it last year. In the 13 and a half games he played, he had 18 receiving touchdowns. 18, which not only paced the league, but obliterated the league. And yes, he missed 2.5 games and still was able to do that. He playing with a top 2 quarterback in the NFL, in my opinion, when Rodgers is on the field. And in points per game, averaged 21.5, which was the 4th highest overall of non-quarterbacks, which includes those league-winning running backs last year with Cook, Henry, and Kamara. So the question marks about Rodgers are going to keep him down here, but even without Rodgers, man, he's still going to be a top 4, top 5 receiver for me, given the fact that he's still going to be the alpha of that team. He's still going to be a consistent touchdown threat. He's still going to be that guy that has both the volume and the ceiling to really combine and give you that ultimate package. So yes, even with Rodgers gone, I'm willing to take this guy in the 2nd round because if Rodgers was there, he'd be worth a mid-1st round pick.
Right. And those 18 touchdowns you talked about, and I'm sure the regression Nazis will be out and talking about how even if Rodgers is back, let's say we know Rodgers is going to be back in August or something like that, 18 touchdowns can't repeat itself. Davante Adams can't get that type of volume because right now, I'm going to tell you this right now, and I know you're on the same page as me. If Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers are on the field together, he's my wide receiver 1, and it's really not even that close. And Davante Adams receives so much red zone inside the 10-yard line, inside the 5-yard line, on the goal line volume that his touchdown numbers are sustainable. It's not like this guy had 18 touchdowns and 7 of them were deep bombs for 45 yards. Like he legitimately had 12 of these touchdowns in the red zone, which is absolutely phenomenal. And that's what makes me concerned about him if Jordan Love is the quarterback, because we don't know if they're going to have that same type of involvement, that same type of connection in the red zone the way Rodgers and Adams do, because anytime Rodgers drops back, we know Adams is the first read every single time. And it makes sense. He's so good in that area of the field, but I have to rank Adams at 5 right now, which is where I have him ranked, because I'm giving this advice as these are redraft rankings for people who are doing best ball right now, because that's the only, redraft content that they're probably consuming is if they're doing best ball drafts. So if you're doing a best ball draft right now, I would take Adams behind some of these top 4 guys, although they all are in the same tier. But if we know that Rodgers is going to be the quarterback, I will take Adams, in the top 8 picks overall.
Easily. Like he would probably be right now, if we knew Rodgers was playing the whole season with the Green Bay Packers, he'd probably be my 106. We're talking about a guy. Yes, we want to lock up the running backs early. I'm fine with it. But with Davante Adams, we're talking about a guy who may have been on pace for possibly the best wide receiver season of all time. Can we just wrap our heads around the fact that in a 16-game pace, last season would have equated to nearly 1,630 receiving yards and 21 touchdowns? That is historic. That's how good Davante Adams is. Davante Adams was last year. So yes, we should expect a little bit of a decline if Aaron Rodgers is there, but I'm not willing to pass on the talent simply due to that situation. Like if he's there in the end of the second round, he's going to be the guy for me. So anyways, we can get off Davante Adams. Everybody, if they're watching this, probably already knows how elite of a talent he is. Let's get on to the number 6 of our consensus. Take it away with Mr. Golden Boy's number 1 target in LA.
Yeah, and I think this is probably a shock to some people. I don't think a lot of people are going to have Keenan Allen ranked this high. And Keenan Allen, when Justin Herbert took over the starting job, he had 1 game with less than 10 targets, and that excludes the Raiders and the Saints game where he was limited or left early in. But of the games that he played that he was healthy, this guy was absolutely peppered with targets. It was a concern that we had going into last year. Is Tyrod Taylor going to, favor Keenan Allen? And then we saw Tyrod Taylor come out and give 10 targets to Mike Williams in the first game, and then everyone was freaking out. And then Justin Herbert takes over the second game, and from there on out, he was just an absolute stud, absolutely phenomenal for fantasy. And if this guy's able to stay healthy, that offense is only going to improve. I've already talked about this, but they drafted a franchise caliber left tackle to replace, Sam Tevy or whoever they were starting last year. Their defense will most likely be healthier than it was last year. It was completely banged up, and hopefully that leads to more takeaways, more 3-and-outs, the way that the Chargers offense can stay on the field and Justin Herbert can stay on the field. I seriously believe that this team is going to be one of the best in the league. And anytime that you're looking at a situation like that, you want to attach yourself to it. And if Justin Herbert, even if he takes a slight downtick from an efficiency perspective, which I don't think is likely to happen, we're still looking at a guy who is locked in for 150 targets. And that's really all that needs to happen when you're talking about a guy that has very elite route running ability, great in the red zone, is going to get some high value targets down the field as well. Keenan Allen is really as safe as they come as a wide receiver. And he's a guy that I'm willing to take over some of these questionable running backs in the third rounds, like Miles Sanders and Josh Jacobs and things of that nature, because I know exactly what I'm getting with Keenan Allen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, currently Keenan Allen, I believe, is my 7. Let me just double check that. Yeah, Keenan Allen's at my 7. We're going to talk about my number 6 in a bit. But in terms of a projectable standpoint, it's so safe when you're talking about Keenan Allen. It's a guy who's gotten that target share over these past 4 years. This is a guy who is the number 1 weapon on what should be a top 5 to 7 offense in the league. This is a guy who showed you Stefon Diggs level usage when he was on the field with Justin Herbert last year. It just goes to show that if he has a maintainable touchdown rate, which we should expect if Justin Herbert is going to have that 30, 35, maybe 40 touchdown season that a lot of people project him for, Keenan Allen is going to be an absolute beast, absolutely eating. And he's currently being projected like that end of the third round type area. This is one of the best value receivers in the entire draft, in my opinion. If I could start off, let's just say hypothetically, I'm at that 103 spot and I go Alvin Kamara, Antonio Gibson. I can start Keenan Allen as my first receiver in that third round to pair with those running backs. I'm all in on that type of value and potential. So overall, this is a middle of the wide receiver 1 type range that you should be looking at for Keenan Allen.
Yeah, and wide receiver 1 overall is absolutely in the cards for this guy.
Yep.
If Justin Herbert is able to take the step that we project he's able to take, we could absolutely see a season where Keenan Allen has 155 targets, he's got 1,400 yards, and he's got like 12 touchdowns or something like that. And that could, pending injuries and things of that nature, that could be enough to get him as the wide receiver 1 overall and definitely a top 5 receiver, which is why he's a guy that I find myself targeting all the time because he's going at a point in the draft where I just have so many question marks about the other positions. Usually the top 3 tight ends are off the board by that point. I'm usually not willing to take Patrick Mahomes if he's even on the board. And then at that point, you're deciding between a guy like Keenan Allen and, like I said, a guy like Miles Sanders or a guy like
Chris
Josh
Carson.
Jacobs or Chris Carson or something of that nature. So I just much rather go with a guy like Keenan Allen. Like I said, I know exactly what I'm getting. And speaking of knowing exactly what you're getting and probably then some, the next guy that we're going to talk about is Calvin Ridley. He's currently my wide receiver 7, I believe. Your wide receiver 8, I want to say. Yeah. So I have him at 7. You have him at 8. He's our 7th overall. And this is the second tier of receivers, if that wasn't clear. We have Keenan Allen as the first guy in the second tier, and then Calvin Ridley in the same tier as him. Julio Jones, by all indications, is an absolute goner. Like, he's going to be traded. Today's June 1st. As of right now, it's just after 4 p.m. And I believe as of right now, he has a clause in his contract that makes him more tradable right now. So we could even see, by the time this video is up, Julio Jones already be traded. And I'm personally drafting Ridley with the assumption that Julio is gone. And Ridley performed despite Atlanta being, a middle of the road offense. I think they have a chance to take a step forward this year. Their offensive line is very young. It should be getting better, and it was banged up last year. Not to mention, Dirk Cutter is always, underwhelmed when it comes to talent on offense. He always gets less out of his talent than is really available. And we saw from Arthur Smith, he was able to elevate the play of all the players in Tennessee. But when you're talking about Calvin Ridley specifically, let's look at his career splits without Julio Jones on the field. And this is going back to his rookie season. And we have a guy that averaged over 20 PPR points per game going back to his rookie season in the 8 games that he's played without Julio Jones. A guy that's getting 7 receptions compared to the 4.5 that he would be getting with Julio Jones on the field. And the touchdowns are actually less in games that he had Julio Jones not on the field. So if he had more touchdown luck, this number would be even bigger. And receiving targets, just look at the difference. 11 targets to 6.5. That's the big draw, and over 100 yards a game that he's averaging. Calvin Ridley is a bona fide number 1 receiver. He's much like a guy like Stefon Diggs. Keenan Allen knows how to get open, knows how to create separation, and can win against top corners. Adam Leviton tweeted this out at the end of the season. Calvin Ridley in 6 games last year without Julio Jones. Look at those numbers. 5 for 110 and 0, 8 for 136 and 0, 6 for 50 and 1. 8 for 124 and 1, 10 for 163 and 1, and 5 for 130 and 0. In each of those games, he finished wide receiver 25 on the week, wide receiver 10, wide receiver 20, wide receiver 3, wide receiver 1, and wide receiver 17. And in only 2 of those games did he not have less than 10 targets. And in both games, he had 9 targets. So 9 or more targets in all 6 games last year without Julio Jones. This is a guy that is going to absolutely feast. He's going to absolutely break out. And he legitimately has top wide receiver overall potential.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Calvin really is a bona fide stud, and we've mentioned it. He is going to be a beast without Julio Jones on the field now. The only argument that people would have, because a lot of people would hear those numbers and say, well, why don't you have him at 3? Why don't you have him at 4? Why don't you have him at 5? We still have to supplement the fact that they are adding Kyle Pitts to that offense. So while we shouldn't expect ungodly type numbers that we saw without Julio Jones last year, because there wasn't another threat like Pitts, we should still expect an alpha type role for this guy, making him that middle end type wide receiver 1. So I fully agree. Even though we have him at 8, I do see a plausible case where Kyle Pitts is really taking attention to that middle of the field, and Calvin Ridley is absolutely able to eat on that outside. So I fully agree. Calvin Ridley is going to be a stud. Let's get into another stud, another guy that broke out last year, because yes, last year was Calvin Ridley's breakout year, even though he had a couple good years before that. Let's talk about a guy who's a rookie, though. Justin Jefferson. This is a guy who just broke the receiving record of all time amongst rookies. Let's talk about guys like Randy Moss, Anquan Bolden. Justin Jefferson outproduced all the Odell Beckham. Justin Jefferson outproduced all of them in terms of a rookie season, and he smashed it. I mean, he had 88 receptions, 1,400 yards, and 7 touchdowns across 16 games, despite not really earning a full-time role until week 3, because he had 6 combined targets in those first 2 games. Week 3 on, this kid averaged a remarkable 18.73 PPR points per game, which equated across a full season would have been the wide receiver 5. I'm betting on the talent of this kid coming off the best rookie season of all time to easily earn his ranking here amongst the elite of the elite at the position. I absolutely love, and I'm all in on Justin Jefferson. This is a guy, the top of the 3rd round, absolutely worth that pick.
Yeah, and some people might have him higher than this. Maybe people are going to be like, oh, you only have him at 8.
I'm at 6.
I have him at 9. So the reason I have him lower is because of, the sure volume bets that I'm getting with guys like Keenan Allen and Calvin Ridley and Michael Thomas, who we're going to talk about next. I've seen him do it before, and I'm not saying Justin Jefferson's like a 1-year wonder by any means. I just want to bake in some risk for the fact that he could have a bit less productive of a sophomore season than we're anticipating, because I think everybody just assumes he's going to build upon what he did in his rookie season, and I think that's the case. I think that's probably what he's going to do, but I have to leave a little bit of room for some latency to his development, because we did see a guy that came out and was a little bit boomer bust in the games that he played. So I just want to account for a guy in Michael Thomas, who we're going to talk about next, who is much more consistent than him and has also been doing it a lot longer.
Next up, we're going to be talking about Michael Thomas. And this is a guy, people want to create the stigma, create the narrative that he was not able to produce without Drew Brees on the field. And that's simply false. As you guys would see on the screen right now, in 2019, in that breakout league winning, one of the best receiver seasons of all time we've seen, The volume was similar to what we saw with Taysom Hill last year. So in the 11 games with Breeze in 2019, you would see those splits over 12 targets per game, 106 receiving yards, and a half a touchdown per game. The volume was there. Over 9 targets, almost 86 receiving yards. The main difference here would be those 0 receiving touchdowns versus nearly half a receiving touchdown per game in 2019. If Jameis Winston is a starter, I'll tell you right now, those receiving touchdowns are already going to go up as a whole because Taysom Hill was not throwing touchdowns at all. Whereas Jameis Winston, we've seen recently, 2 years ago, this guy throw for over 30 touchdowns. So I don't think the receiving touchdowns being at 0 is going to be an issue going forward. And if we can maintain that level of volume that we saw even without Breeze last year, we're still talking about a guy who was on pace for 120 receptions, 1,372 receiving yards on 148 targets, which the receptions would have ranked 2nd in the league, and the receiving yards would have ranked 7th in the league, respectively. The main detractor, again, is the touchdowns. I expect those to naturally positive regress, as always. I know it's a common little thing that people want to say, oh, we should expect positive regression. In Michael Thomas's case, there is no shot he produces 0 touchdowns across a full season.
Yeah. Which, yeah, that should be obvious. But yeah, it is true. Michael Thomas's numbers, had he scored 2 touchdowns in those games, he would have been averaging the same 20 PPR points per game that he always averaged. So I know a lot of people are going to be down on him because not only did he have a injury-riddled season, it was nagging injuries that forced you to keep him on your roster. It's not like he came out and tore his ACL week 1 and we knew he was done for the season right away. He came out, got a high ankle sprain. Shout out to Sean Payton for leaving him on the field after we were already losing. Guess he, get what goes around comes around. But Michael Thomas comes out, gets a high ankle sprain. He's questionable throughout the season. By week 8, he's starting to come back and then starts to get banged up again. It was just a completely injury-riddled season. It was a bad situation for him, and people are going to hold it against him. And this is a guy that you legitimately had to spend a top 8 overall pick on last year in fantasy drafts that you can legitimately get in the mid-3rd round this year. You could start your draft with, like Danny said, you could start your draft with Alvin Kamara and Antonio Gibson in the first 2 rounds and come back and get Michael Thomas as your wide receiver 1, a guy that's locked into 150 plus targets.
Yeah, I mean, that is an absolute way to win your league at the draft, being able to combine those elite running back potentials with a guy who's locked and loaded to repeat as that wide receiver 1 for the Saints offense this year. So I'm absolutely back in on Michael Thomas, as Twitter would say. But anyways, we can get on to the next guy, and that's actually going to be DK Metcalf landing here at the 10 spot for us in consensus. So as we pointed out with Russell Wilson, the 2020 season for the Seattle Seahawks was really a tale of 2 halves. I mean, you guys can see the splits on the screen, but just the overall production from those first 8 to last 8 is remarkable. That PPR 21.23 points per game would have ranked him as wide receiver 3 on PPR points per game. That 12.94 would have ranked him, I think it was wide receiver 34, which is just insane to think about a guy of DK Metcalf's potential, DK Metcalf's talent, having that type of fluctuating in his overall production. And the main reason why his production tailed off so much is that 6 of those final 8 games came against top 10 defenses versus opposing wide receivers, as I mentioned with Russ. He faced the Rams 2 times, which were the overall best team at limiting opposing wide receivers. The football team once, which finished 2nd. The Bills 5th, Cardinals 10th, and Giants 8th. The 2 outliers in this stretch were the New York Jets in a game that Seattle went up early and really ran the ball down the Jets' throats the rest of the game. Russ only had 27 total passing attempts in that game versus 36 Seahawks rushing attempts. And the other game in that stretch was against Philadelphia, who was 25th. And that was on prime time where DK, just put up 10 for 177 on them. So concerning that he does play the Rams again 2 times a year, obviously, and Cardinals 2 times a year, but they lost their number 1 corner in the offseason, so can we really even say that's a big negative? DK Metcalf should absolutely have more positive regression in terms of being able to even out those splits. While we might not see wide receiver 3 PPR points per game like we did in the first 8 games of the season, he should absolutely be in that top 10 range, given what we saw in terms of the offense rolling. The problem that will always affect the Seahawks, will always affect Russ, is that the inconsistency is always going to remain an underlying factor for these guys.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, the Seahawks do have a bit more of a challenging schedule this year. They're not like at the top of the league in the easiest schedule in the league. So DK Metcalf, the fact that he is a little bit more, volatile in matchups, that's a bit harder, and understandably so. In the games that you talked about, he would have been playing Ramsey twice. He would have had to face Tre'Davious White. He would have had to face James Bradbury, all of whom played like top 5 corners last year and absolutely locked down number 1 receivers. So it's tough for a guy like DK Metcalf because he has those kind of guys in his division and on his schedule. But at the same time, you're DK Metcalf. You got to produce in some kind of tough matchups. And we saw guys like DeAndre Hopkins and Stefon Diggs and those kind of guys produce in those kind of matchups. And that's what separates them from DK Metcalf, because maybe Metcalf takes that step in year 3 going into his 3rd year. He can outproduce Jalen Ramsey when Jalen Ramsey's draped all over him, but we haven't seen it yet, which is why I have him ranked at wide receiver 11. I believe you have him at wide receiver 9. He's just outside of that range. I can see a conversation for having him in the same area of a guy like Calvin Ridley or of a guy like Keenan Allen, but at the same time, he doesn't really get the target volume and the offense isn't consistently passing the ball anyway. So that volatility is probably always going to sit with the Seahawks, like we talked about with Russ.
Yep, absolutely. So we can get on to the next guy on our list, and that's actually going to be my guy. You see the team behind me. We're going to be talking about Amari Cooper, the wide receiver #1 for the Cowboys. And you guys can see the splits on the screen. Those first 4 games with Dak, I'm not going to count the 5th because he only played half a game. All right. Those first 4 games with Dak were literally some of the best we've seen. Again, a wide receiver 4 PPR points per game pace. We talked about it with DK Metcalf, that 21.93, I believe it was, points per game. Amari Cooper was right there. And the thing that people are going to point to right off the bat is this guy was averaging nearly 13 targets per game. And I understand that. Again, he's not going to finish with 200 targets on the season, but those 0.25 receiving touchdowns per game are going to go up this year. The reason being, Dak Prescott only had a 4% touchdown rate on his throws last year. For a guy of his skill set, for an offense of this efficiency, that's going to positively regress, as we saw throughout his career before that. He had 30 touchdowns the year before on just about 600 attempts. It's going to even itself out. And Amari Cooper being that #1 target is going to have more receiving touchdowns than what we saw in that sample size. So you're getting a guy who is going to still get elite volume. While he may not see 12.75 targets per game, if we're talking about a guy who still finished with 9.5, 10 targets per game, we're still projecting an elite volume wide receiver 1 on what should be a top 5 scoring offense. And before anybody really points to those last 12 games of the season, can we just acknowledge the fact that this guy was playing with Andy Dalton, Ben DiNucci, and Garrett Gilbert across the stretch? Don't take anything of the fact that he was only averaging 7 targets and 60 yards per game in that stretch, because that is not going to be the case when Mr. Number 4, Dak Prescott, 2021 MVP, is on the field.
Yeah, Danny's Cowboys fandom just came out in full swing on that take, but I agree with him. So for those of you that don't want Danny's take on it because he's a biased Cowboys fan, I agree with him. I have Amari Cooper inside my top 12 as well. I currently have him at 12. You have him at 11. So we are very close on this one. Amari Cooper has always been more consistent ever since he's been on the Dallas Cowboys. He was very inconsistent on the Raiders, but that seemed to be more of a product of Derek Carr. Ever since he's been with Dak Prescott, he's been a much better fantasy option. And I think we saw last year, the start that Amari Cooper was on, not necessarily probably sustainable for the full season because they were passing the ball like 60 times a game. But nonetheless, this guy was on a pace probably to be a top 5 receiver. And that got, obviously taken away when Dak Prescott got hurt.
Yeah, for sure. Again, I don't expect this guy to have 148 receptions, nearly 1,700 receiving yards. But if we're talking about a guy who, at his full strength, at his full potential, could produce 120, 1,300 yards, 8-10 touchdowns, I can see him having a Stefon Diggs level type of season because he's a similar player to really what Diggs is. Honestly, a good route runner, great separator on a very efficient offense. So I can absolutely see him taking that next step in towards that fantasy superstar type level if we have a sustained full season with him and Dak.
Right. And he is still the #1 target in that offense, as you mentioned. CeeDee Lamb is going to probably see an increased role in his second year, but Michael Gallup, we saw he was not, even with Dak playing out the way he was playing and the way the Cowboys offense was throwing the ball, you still really couldn't trust Michael Gallup at the beginning of the season, even in that situation. So those are the 2 receivers to own, and Amari Cooper is the guy that I would prefer to own early on, especially. So the next guy that we're going to get into, and we're going back-to-back homer takes here because I have Mike Evans at wide receiver 10, I believe, in my rankings. He ends up being our wide receiver 12 in consensus because you have him at 16. So I'm pretty fair amount higher on him than you are. There's obviously concerns with Mike Evans. I understand that people are going to have some concerns with him. He scored 13 touchdowns last year, which is, it's hard to repeat that. And there's so many weapons in that offense that he might be a little bit inconsistent. I would imagine those are the 2 biggest concerns that people are going to have with Mike Evans. But here's the thing. We talk about it all the time. Attach yourself to good situations. Brady and Evans had a connection last year. It was very, very obvious to me that Mike Evans is his number one guy. It's the reason Mike Evans was only second to Davante Adams in targets inside the 10-yard line. He was a guy that was absolutely trusted in that role. And like I said for Adams, it's easier to project a guy to repeat high touchdown production if that's how he got it, was inside the red zone targets, not deep plays or, fluke plays, broken tackles, and things of that nature. Well, Evans is not going to get 145, 150 targets like probably the next guy that we're going to talk about might. He's going to get the most valuable targets for a top 5 offense, which is the downfield targets, which we know Mike Evans has made a career of, coming down with, and in the red zone, as I mentioned. If you have a problem trusting efficiency over volume, then take some of the more volume-packed guys over Mike Evans, like Allen Robinson, who we're going to talk about. But the reality is, that you are able to trust efficiency, in two situations. When the player is very talented, which Mike Evans obviously is. He's the only player in NFL history to start his career with 7 straight 1,000-yard seasons. And B, when the situation is excellent, which it absolutely is, catching passes from Tom Brady in his second season in Arians' system. And now that Mike Evans is fully healthy, because Mike Evans started the season basically on IR, more or less. He played all 16 games, but he was not healthy the first 5 games, suffered a hamstring injury right at the end of training camp. He's riskier, I would say, than some of the guys that we're going to talk about in a second, but he's going around pick 40. And as your wide receiver 2 in most cases, especially in best ball, this is a dude that has a weekly ceiling like nobody's business.
Oh, definitely. Again, I though I have him at 16, that doesn't mean anything against Evans. That's just how talented this tier 3, if you will, wide receivers is. And I also do have his teammate a little bit higher. When we're talking about Evans, people want to make it so much harder than it needs to be. Just think of it from a simplistic point of view. I'm sure you're going to put the tweet up as I'm saying this, but you tweeted out the other day that you think if Tom Brady's dropping back in the red zone and he sees 6'5", 240-pound Mike Evans lining up against a 5'11" cornerback, he's just going to force it to Scotty Miller, Rob Gronkowski, OJ Howard, Tyler Johnson because, they have too many weapons. Like, no, teams don't think like that. If Mike Evans is your elite touchdown scorer of the offense and his size and strength and verticality are always going to be an advantage in the red zone, why does he have to go down from 13 touchdowns? Why do people want to just say, he caught 13 touchdowns and 70 catches last year? That 18% rate, that has to go. No, he is going to be the elite red zone weapon of an elite offense. Fantasy doesn't have to be hard. Don't make it harder than it is. Take Mike Evans with wide receiver 2 expectations with potential wide receiver 1 weekly ceilings. I absolutely love Evans, although I have him at 16. That doesn't mean I hate the guy. That just goes to show you how elite I think this offense can be, because I do have both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans in my top 16. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. And like you said, if the touchdown rate is what bothers you, because I know it's going to be mentioned over and over again all offseason that Mike Evans had a high touchdown rate. So did Tyreek Hill. So did A.J. Brown. So did Davante Adams. It's because they're all in great situations. Obviously, they're going to have a high touchdown rate. They have great quarterbacks and they're great players. That's basically what happens when you meet quarterback and great receiver talent. They're going to score touchdowns more often than not. So yeah, he has a high touchdown rate, but what are you even comparing his touchdown rate to? Are you comparing it to another great receiver and another great offense? Or are you comparing it to a league average receiver in a league average situation? That comparison doesn't make any sense to me. So let's move on to the next guy before we get too in depth with Mike Evans.
I'll say one thing though. You mentioned it. You hit the nail on the head. People want to just point at negative regression without comparing the player to player. Like, we're not comparing Mike Evans to frickin' prime Julian Edelman. We're not comparing Mike Evans to frickin' Sterling Shepard. We're comparing Mike Evans to a 6'5", 240-pound beast. You want to compare Mike Evans to any type of touchdown scorer? Compare him to a Randy Moss. Compare him to somebody that can typically put up those double-digit touchdowns with ease, because that is what Mike Evans has shown throughout his career. Anyways, let's move off. Let's get to the next guy, Allen Robinson. This is the most perennially disrespected real-life NFL wide receiver, and he's had the production to really match that type of talent. He's finished as the PPR wide receiver 9 and wide receiver 7, respectively, these past 2 years, and now receives the biggest quarterback upgrade of his entire career with Justin Fields coming in. The only thing that I will say is, okay, maybe Justin Fields doesn't play the first few games. Maybe once he comes in, it takes him a while to really develop that rapport. But regardless, even if Justin Fields takes that little bit of period to adjust, I view Allen Robinson as a locked-in top 14 at minimum wide receiver this year. The problem that I have with him, and why, although people may argue him higher, why I kind of have him at this fringe 1 range, is that I just prefer the ceilings of the guys that I've mentioned before up to this point. Even you mentioned like Amari Cooper, DK Metcalf, even Michael Thomas, guys like that. I prefer the ceilings of those guys to Allen Robinson. Although he's a near lock to finish around where you take him, is he ever really going to win you a week, going to win you a season? I don't really think he has that case. Although if you're getting this guy in the 4th round, I don't really care if he's winning me a week or a season because he's going to be that consistent high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1 if I go in RB heavy. He's just the perfect complement type piece in your fantasy lineups.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And what you said, I think, needs to be repeated. The fact that Justin Fields might not start right away is a real thing. And to me, Allen Robinson screams, don't draft him, trade for him later. Because if Andy Dalton is going to start the first, 3-4 games or something like that, then this is a guy that fantasy owners are going to sour on quickly. And especially because I'd imagine there's going to be 4 or 5 receivers in the same range as Allen Robinson, because there is every year, that are absolutely snapping off at the beginning of the season. Everyone's going to be like, damn it, I can't believe I took Allen Robinson over Terry McLaurin. I can't believe I took Allen Robinson over CeeDee Lamb or whoever else is going off that at that point in the draft. And I think you're going to be able to get Allen Robinson at a discount. I haven't seen his schedule off the top of my head. I don't know how good his schedule is to begin the season, but I think if he has Andy Dalton as his quarterback, you might be disappointed with the first couple games. But if Justin Fields is able to come in and make this offense a lot better right away, then we could be talking about Allen Robinson having a back half of the season that wins people leagues.
Yeah, for sure. So we can get on to the next guy on this list. And he's kind of similar in a way that he's really disrespected from the general public, really, when it comes to being named as top wide receivers, because Terry McLaurin is an absolute baller. I mean, this is mine. This is your guy. We've thought that the talent of this guy has been tremendous ever since coming in the league as a 3rd-round rookie and lighting it up right away. We've talked in depth already about the potential increase in upside of the Washington football team offense comparatively to these recent years. And if this offense is good, the main beneficiary of that is going to be Antonio Gibson, as how we're going to mention in the RB rankings, and Terry McLaurin being those 2 best offensive playmakers on the offense. Fitzpatrick has a huge upgrade over what we've seen Terry McLaurin play with and produce with, an 1,100-yard wide receiver and a PPR wide receiver 20 last year with Taylor Heineke, Alex Smith, and Dwayne Haskins all starting games. If Fitzpatrick performs even 80% of what we think his potential might be on this team, Terry McLaurin is going to flirt with that top 15 overall wide receiver production. And this is a guy who's poised to make that 1,300 receiving yard type jump, because we've seen him produce 1,100 with garbage.
Yeah, and I totally think who's this year's Calvin Ridley, who's this year's Chris Godwin, this is the pick. I think this is the pick. I think it's Terry McLaurin. I think you're looking at a situation that yielded 26th most points in the league last year with the Washington football team offense. Like you said, Taylor Heineke, Alex Smith, Dwayne Haskins. I think Kyle Allen even might have started games last year. Just terrible quarterback play. And Terry McLaurin has taken passes from these guys his career so far, and you can even add Case Keenum to that list. This is by far the best quarterback he's played with. I know Fitzpatrick isn't the best quarterback in the league, but I would say he's probably a top 15, top 20 quarterback in the league. And that is a huge upgrade over what we saw Terry McLaurin play with his entire career. And this is a quarterback that can legitimately bring him to finally exceeding 5 touchdowns in a season, because Terry McLaurin was only wide receiver 20 last year because he only scored 4 touchdowns. If he would have scored 8 touchdowns, he probably would have been a top 12 wide receiver, top 15 at worst. So if this is a guy that can get him to that 1,300, 1,400 yard territory and 8 to 10 touchdowns, he's going to have a Calvin Ridley, a Chris Godwin-like leap in his 3rd season.
Yep, I absolutely agree with that. So we can head on to the final name on the list. If you guys have made it this far, and you made it to number 15 on our wide receiver list, comment down below, go Habs.
No, don't comment go Habs down below, because the Leafs are a putrid system. You sent me that thing of Mitch Marner going golfing today, and I almost threw up. So anyways, let's get into Chris Godwin. I just touched on him when I was talking about Terry McLaurin, but Chris Godwin, to me, I have him ranked below Mike Evans. You have him ranked ahead of Mike Evans. The thing with both of these guys that I wanted to touch on real quick that I didn't talk about before is neither of these guys probably have top 3 wide receiver upside, because they're going to eat into each other. But that's all that argument really holds weight to. Everybody wants to talk about, oh, well, Chris Godwin can't be a wide receiver 1 because Mike Evans and Antonio Brown are there. No, like, he absolutely can be a wide receiver 1. He can't be a top 3 wide receiver because Mike Evans and Antonio Brown are there. Despite the hand injury last year and the lower body stuff that he dealt with, he was still on pace for 112 targets, 87 receptions, 1,152 yards and 10 touchdowns, which would have been the wide receiver 9 in PPR, wide receiver 8.5 PPR. This is a top 5 scoring offense, like I said. And he was able to absolutely surge, and he made this offense much, much better when he was on the field. 32 points per game when Godwin was in the lineup versus 28 when he was out of the lineup. Godwin was also able to surge once Antonio Brown joined the team. And when he came back from his thumb injury, despite the addition of Antonio Brown, his pace numbers would have been very similar to the wide receiver 9, wide receiver 8, as I talked about, if you continue them throughout the playoffs. And the reason I have him behind Evans, though, is probably because Mike Evans has a monopoly on his area of the field. And what I mean by that is that Chris Godwin is a slot receiver on the team. Antonio Brown played more of a possession receiver role, and Mike Evans is the deep threat. So Antonio Brown and Chris Godwin both are hovering in that 8 to 10 average depth of target range, whereas Mike Evans is over 12. So Antonio Brown and Chris Godwin are probably going to eat into each other's targets more than Antonio Brown will eat into Mike Evans' targets, or Chris Godwin will eat into Mike Evans' targets. It's just the way that the offense is structured. It's the way that Bruce Arians uses Chris Godwin. And plus Evans has the red zone role that Chris Godwin has a little bit, but not to the extent that Mike Evans has it. So to me, that's why I have Evans higher. I think they're both top 20 wide receivers, and I'm very comfortable with both of those guys as my wide receiver 2, although I would like a bit better of a wide receiver 1 to pair with those guys.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. Again, I actually acquired Godwin in a recent dynasty trade I made where I shipped off Calvin Ridley, Darius Layton, and a 3rd-round pick in 2024. Ended up getting, I think it was Godwin, Thielen, and a 2023 second. So overall, I still think the potential of this guy, we saw it 2 years ago. Even last year, when, as you mentioned, when he played and he was hurt, he was still on pace for a very respectable season. So if we expect this offense to, again, you mentioned 32 point per game type of offense, he's going to produce. He's going to produce fringe top 12 type numbers. And I think both of him and Evans, as I mentioned with the Cowboys offense, those are the 2 best offenses in the NFC, in my opinion, apart from maybe the Rams could flirt with them as well. But
and the
right now,
if Rodgers stays probably too.
Yeah, I'm assuming Rodgers is gone, but overall, like, these teams are going to be able to put up points, and they are built on very strong wide receiver cores. So in theory, the receivers are going to be able to produce. Don't just talk to me about DJ Chark is going to produce him because he's the official wide receiver 1 on that depth. Like, no, like, can we stop? Just because he's a wide receiver 2 on a great offense doesn't mean he's going to be worse than a wide receiver 1 on an absolute dog shit offense.
Yeah, which is mostly the case, that people get in their heads that wide receiver 1s are better for fantasy, but in reality, it's usually the opposite. That's the case. When you're the wide receiver 1 on an offense that's going to score over 550 points a game, and you're the wide receiver 2 on that offense, it's better than being the wide receiver 1 on an offense that's going to score 325 points per game when you think about simple math that way, because the Bucks are going to score points. It's just going to happen. And I know if you guys are using these rankings right now for best ball, this is one of the cheapest prices you're ever going to get Chris Godwin and Mike Evans for best ball, because at that point, you don't even have the concerns about inconsistencies because it's best ball. You don't even have to choose when to start the guys. And even in season long, I think you're going to know when to start these guys, which is every single week, because yeah, they're going to have some down weeks here and there. If someone catches a touchdown, someone doesn't catch a touchdown. But the same thing can be said for any other offense in the NFL. And not many offenses are going to score more points than the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which is why I have both of these guys inside my top 15. So quickly over some honorable mentions, some guys that you would have seen on the screen earlier in the video when we showed our top 20. We don't have time to get into our full top 20 in depth, but currently at wide receiver 16 in consensus between us, we have CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb, same argument for Cooper. When you look at his numbers with Dak, he was phenomenal. He was on pace for a much better season than he ended up having once Dak was out of the lineup, but he still had a pretty respectable season for a rookie receiver anyway. If you have something to say on your dude, you can go ahead.
I'll just quickly say it. I mean, yes, this guy was on pace for a 1,300-yard season when Dak was healthy. Well, again, it might be tough to predict because it was only in a 4-game sample size. He showed last year, despite having, quote-unquote, less than 1,000 receiving yards, which people only really look to as production nowadays, he was phenomenal. If you watch the games, Andy Dalton just absolutely levered this offense down. With the full healthy Dak back in town, I think, again, I'm going to say it right now. We're going to talk about bold predictions videos going up. I wouldn't be shocked if we're looking at Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb both being top 12 receivers, because that's what they paced out to last year when this offense was humming and hoeing in those first 4 games. And that's why, again, I have CeeDee Lamb as my wide receiver 15 right now going in. And that's me, honestly, in my opinion, being cautious about the situation, because I've seen people have him much higher than even me, probably one of the most biased Cowboys fans you can get, having him.
And I have him at 19 again. So for the non-biased opinion, I have him at 19. He's still inside my top 20. I absolutely feel comfortable with him as my wide receiver 2. Probably not my wide receiver 1 on any fantasy teams that I have. But again, this is a guy that legitimately has that Calvin Ridley, that Chris Godwin type potential in his second season, because we saw what he did as a rookie. And then DJ Moore, another guy that probably is a bit of a lower ceiling projection because we don't really know what we're going to get out of Sam Darnold. But if Sam Darnold can show really anything that he showed at USC or do anything similar to what Ryan Tannehill did when he escaped Adam Gase, then we could be talking about DJ Moore as one of the steals of fantasy drafts. Because if that's the case and Sam Darnold comes out and plays like Ryan Tannehill, we could be looking at DJ Moore coming out and playing like AJ Brown.
Yep. No, I absolutely agree. And we've talked about DJ Moore's potential talent for literally the last 2 years. Heck, we made a bold predictions video last year where I said this guy would lead the league in receiving yards. Well, that didn't come to fruition. The talent just didn't go out of the way. The competition ended up increasing itself. If we had a Terry McLaurin-like level of projection for this offense, I wouldn't be surprised if I had DJ Moore as a top 12 overall wide receiver. So anyways, we can talk about the final three kind of or not really in depth, but real quickly. Julio Jones, 18. This guy would be much higher if we had the certainty of where he was playing with or who he was playing with in 2021. And the final two on this list are going to be Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. It's easy. We talked about it with Evans. We talked about it with Cooper, Lamb, Godwin. The Rams are going to be one of the best offenses in the NFL. Those two wide receivers are going to eat with Matthew Stafford, a clear and concise upgrade over Jared Goff, slinging them the rock. We've seen these guys produce with Jared Goff in 2017, 2018, 2019. Matt Stafford is going to be able to support them to a much better degree than what even Goff was.
Yeah, and both of those guys are in for some serious touchdown luck too. And that's where Matthew Stafford is probably going to make the biggest difference, because we saw Cooper Kupp produce touchdowns in the past. He didn't produce them last year. And Robert Woods has always struggled to produce touchdowns. So if Matthew Stafford can come in and throw 35, 40 touchdowns, which Jared Goff has really never done in his career, then we could be looking at a situation where both of these guys are teetering on that double-digit touchdown range. And Cooper Kupp specifically, who I have ranked higher because of that touchdown difference between the two guys, that makes up the ceiling between them. I think Cooper Kupp legitimately has potential to lead the league in touchdowns.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Again, you guys would have seen my rankings. I currently have Kupp at 18, and I even feel this is being cautious because, quite frankly, I can see him finishing much higher than that, especially if he develops that rapport with Stafford. And I know it might be just saying something random. People might say, well, there's no objective analysis to this, but I have a gut feeling that Matt Stafford is really going to enjoy obviously both of them, but I think his main guy is going to end up being Kupp. I don't know why it is. Don't quiz me on it, but I have a feeling.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me because Kupp is the slot guy. He's the easy target. No matter how good of a quarterback you are, you always appreciate easy targets. And Kupp is the easiest target on the team because he primarily plays in the slot. And he's also bigger than Woods. And in the red zone, that makes a bit of a difference as well. So if you guys enjoyed this video, like we said, like, comment, subscribe to the channel if you are new. On the screen right now, you can see it going across the bottom of the screen, underdogfantasy.com, promo code FSE at sign up will get you a $25 deposit bonus that you can use to enter the Best Ball Mania tournament, which gets you a crack at $1 million. As Danny mentioned, comment down below. What did you tell him to comment?
Go Habs, baby.
Oh yeah, don't comment that. Comment the Leafs are a terrible franchise instead, because that's the more truth aspect of it. So yeah, if you guys do the Underdog thing, remember you get both of our draft guides totally for free. Peace out and enjoy your Tuesday.